Gross domestic product, GDP, is a monetary measure of the market value of all the final goods and services produced in a specific time period. GDP, nominal, per capita does not, however, reflect differences in the cost of living and the inflation rates of the countries. Therefore, using a basis of GDP per capita purchasing power parity, PPP, is arguably more useful when comparing living standards between nations, while nominal GDP is more useful comparing national economies on the international market. The ERA defines GDP as an aggregate measure of production equal to the sum of the gross values added of all resident and institutional units engaged in production and services, plus any taxes, and minus any subsidies, on products not included in the value of their outputs. An IMF publication states that GDP measures the monetary value of final goods and services that are bought by the final user produced in a country in a given period of time, say a quarter or year. Total GDP can also be broken down into the contribution of each industry or sector of the economy. The ratio of GDP to the total population of the region is the per capita GDP, and the same is called mean standard of living. GDP is considered the world's most powerful statistical indicator of national development and progress. William Petty came up with a basic concept of GDP to attack landlords against unfair taxation during warfare between the Dutch and the English between 1654 and 1676. Charles Davenant developed the method further in 1695. The modern concept of GDP was first developed by Simon Kuznets for a U.S. Congress report in 1934. In this report, Kuznets warned against its use as a measure of welfare, see below under limitations and criticisms. After the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, GDP became the main tool for measuring a country's economy. At the time, gross national product, GNP, was a preferred estimate, which differed from GDP in that it measured production by a country's citizens at home and abroad rather than its resident institutional units, see definition above. The switch from GNP to GDP in the US was in 1991, trailing behind most other nations. The role that measurements of GDP played in World War II was crucial to the subsequent political acceptance of GDP values as indicators of national development and progress. A crucial role was played here by the U.S. Department of Commerce under Milton Gilbert, where ideas from Kuznets were embedded into institutions. The history of the concept of GDP should be distinguished from the history of changes in ways of estimating it. The value added by firms is relatively easy to calculate from their accounts, but the value added by the public sector, by financial industries, and by intangible asset creation is more complex. These activities are increasingly important in developed economies, and the international conventions governing their estimation and their inclusion or exclusion in GDP regularly change in an attempt to keep up with industrial advances. In the words of one academic economist, the actual number for GDP is therefore the product of a vast patchwork of statistics and a complicated set of processes carried out on the raw data to fit them to the conceptual framework. In response to these and other limitations of using GDP, alternative approaches have emerged. In the 1980s, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum developed the capability approach, which focuses on the functional capabilities enjoyed by people within a country, rather than the aggregate wealth held within a country. These capabilities consist of the functions that a person is able to achieve. In 1990, Maqbul Haq, a Pakistani economist at the United Nations, introduced the Human Development Index, HDI. The HDI is a composite index of life expectancy at birth, adult literacy rate and standard of living measured as a logarithmic function of GDP, adjusted to purchasing power parity. In 1989, John B. Cobb and Herman Daly introduced Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, ISO, by taking into account various other factors such as consumption of non-renewable resources and degradation of the environment. The new formula deducted from GDP, personal consumption plus public non-defensive expenditures, private defensive expenditures plus capital formation plus services from domestic labor, costs of environmental degradation, depreciation of natural capital. In 2005, Matt Jones, an American economist at the International Institute of Management, introduced the first secular Gross National Happiness Index, also known as Gross National Well-Being Framework and Index, to complement GDP economics with additional 7 dimensions, including environment, education and government, work, social and health, mental and physical indicators. The proposal was inspired by the King of Bhutan's GNH philosophy. In 2009, the European Union released a communication titled GDP and Beyond. measuring progress in a changing world that identified 5 actions to improve the indicators of progress in ways that make it more responsive to the concerns of its citizens, introduced a proposal to complementing GDP with environmental and social indicators in 2009. Professors Joseph Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and Jean-Paul Fitoussi at the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, CMEPSP, formed by French President Nicolas Sarkozy, published a proposal to overcome the limitation of GDP economics to expand the focus to well-being economics with well-being framework consisting of health, environment, work, physical safety, economic safety, political freedom. In 2012, the Karmara of the Center for Bhutan Studies published Bhutan Local GNH Index contributors to happiness, physical, mental and spiritual health, time balance, social and community vitality, cultural vitality, education, living standards, good governance, and ecological vitality. The Bhutan GNH Index. In 2013, ERIC Better Life Index was published by the ERIC. The dimensions of the index included health, economic, workplace, income, jobs, housing, civic engagement, life satisfaction. Since 2012, John Halliwell, Richard Laird and Jeffrey Sachs have edited an annual World Happiness Report which reports a national measure of subjective well-being, derived from a single survey question on satisfaction with life. GDP explains some of the cross-national variation in life satisfaction, but more of it is explained by other social variables. See 2013 World Happiness Report. In 2019, Search Arab Sanar published a GDP 3.0 proposal which combines an expanded GNI formula which he calls MIX, with a Palmer ratio and a set of environmental metrics based on the daily rule. Ever since the development of GDP, multiple observers have pointed out limitations of using GDP as the overarching measure of economic and social progress. For example, many environmentalists argue that GDP is a poor measure of social progress because it does not take into account harm to the environment. Although a high or rising level of GDP is often associated with increased economic and social progress within a country, a number of scholars have pointed out that this does not necessarily play out in many instances. For example, Jean Drez and Amartya Sen have pointed out that an increase in GDP or in GDP growth does not necessarily lead to a higher standard of living, particularly in areas such as healthcare and education. Another important area that does not necessarily improve along with GDP is political liberty, which is most notable in China, where GDP growth is strong yet political liberties are heavily restricted. GDP does not account for the distribution of income among the residents of a country, because GDP is merely an aggregate measure. An economy may be highly developed or growing rapidly, but also contain a wide gap between the rich and the poor in a society. These inequalities often occur on the lines of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, or other minority status within countries. This can lead to misleading characterizations of economic well-being if the income distribution is heavily skewed toward the high end, as the poorer residents will not directly benefit from the overall level of wealth and income generated in their country. Even GDP per capita measures may have the same downside if inequality is high. For example, South Africa during apartheid ranked high in terms of GDP per capita, but the benefits of this immense wealth and income were not shared equally among the country. GDP does not take into account the value of household and other unpaid work. Some, including Martha Nussbaum, argue that this value should be included in measuring GDP, as household labor is largely a substitute for goods and services that would otherwise be purchased for value. Even under conservative estimates, the value of unpaid labor in Australia has been calculated to be over 50% of the country's GDP. A later study analyzed this value in other countries, with results ranging from a low of about 15% in Canada to high of nearly 70% in the United Kingdom. For the United States, the value was estimated to be between about 20% on the low end to nearly 50% on the high end, depending on the methodology being used. Because many public policies are shaped by GDP calculations and by the related field of national accounts, the non-inclusion of unpaid work in calculating GDP can create distortions in public policy, and some economists have advocated for changes in the way public policies are formed and implemented. The UK's Natural Capital Committee highlighted the shortcomings of GDP in its advice to the UK government in 2013, pointing out that GDP focuses on flows, not stocks. As a result, an economy can run down its assets yet, at the same time, record high levels of GDP growth, until a point is reached where the depleted assets act as a check on future growth. They then went on to say that it is apparent that the recorded GDP growth rate overstates a sustainable growth rate. Broader measures of well-being and wealth are needed for this, and there is a danger that short-term decisions based solely on what is currently measured by national accounts may prove to be costly in the long term. It has been suggested that countries that have authoritarian governments, such as the People's Republic of China and Russia, inflate their GDP figures.